Hello there, I'm Steve. I'm going to show you some easy ways to fix soldering mistakes like blobs and bridges in your circuitry, and go through a few steps to inspect your soldering jobs. And hopefully this will make electronics a little bit more fun and help you enjoy your projects a little bit more. Okay, let's get started. One of the most important parts of a soldering station is the sponge. The sponge needs to be damp, not wet, and it will not work dry. It's the dampness of the sponge that shocks the solder off the soldering tip without cooling off the soldering tip too much. The way you use a sponge is to swipe, not rub, the soldering tip across the sponge. The hole in my soldering sponge catches the solder and keeps it from flying all over the place. That's how a soldering sponge works. One of the most important things to do in each step of your project is to inspect how you placed and oriented each component, especially in a board or in the place it goes in the project. Okay? That's the first step to getting things to go right. You inspect where it's placed and how it's oriented, if they're marked that way in your documentation. Transistors may not show a marking, but they show how they're laid out, and you place it the way they're laid out into your board. That's the correct orientation. Diodes are marked with a cathode end, and that goes where that mark shows up either on the board or in your documentation. Some capacitors and other parts are marked. You follow your documentation so that all components are placed and oriented correctly in your board before you do any soldering on the next step. For integrated circuits, you always look for the mark that indicates the top of the IC, and pin 1 is always the first pin on the top left of all ICs. Okay, you look for the mark, a notch or a dot that indicates pin 1. The small dot here is pin 1. And they all go counterclockwise. Pin 1 is top left. The last pin is always top right. So you just find the mark, and that's how you orient integrated circuits on your boards. One of my favorite little rules for checking for soldering mistakes is that no adjacent pads should be connected with solder. Okay, that includes wires and leads and everything else. No adjacent pads should be connected with solder. If you look at my little transistor here as a demonstration in this circuit, I put a little bit too much solder between two of the terminals and created a solder blob. That breaks rule 1, sort of. No adjacent pads should be connected together. It's a great little, test for how you did soldering. And it may actually find some of your more concealed errors. So no adjacent pad should be connected together. Check your documentation, of course, to see what is supposed to be connected. To fix soldering mistakes in your circuits like this one, get a clean, hot, tinned soldering tip, a little hotter than normal. Place it in the soldering blob or bridge, okay? Get the blob or bridge hot, okay? And then pull it out quickly. I call that flicking it out, okay? Usually I lay my soldering tip down a little closer to the board to get more solder onto it, and that gets more solder out. So again, heat it up and flick it out. Working on big blobs like this, just work on little parts of it at a time. A clean, hot tinned soldering tip is your best tool. I run mine a little hotter than I would normally use for the components here, but that's what you have to do. You want to be fast here. You want to work on each little part. You lay the soldering tip into the blobber bridge on the board, pass it on the board between the pads very quickly, and that cleans out the solder effectively. See how I'm doing it here. Heat it up and snap a little bit with a flick to get it out. And you just keep on working on it until you get each little part out. Electronics can be fun if you know the basics. I know electronics is complicated, but that is electronics. And soldering just happens to be a big part of any major electronics that you'll ever do. And so learning the basics of soldering, and this is one of my favorite methods of keeping the soldering fun, is knowing how to fix your mistakes. And again, the soldering tip is all I use most of the time. Get the blobs hot and flick them out. You see how easy this is cleaning up this whole area. Of course, being a geek is never fun. Nobody ever really understands you, but when you learn the basics, like I'm saying about electronics and inspecting your work and soldering, you can make electronics fun, and you can have much more fun with your projects, and that would make me happy. And I hope you get that out of this video, because it is fun.